One of the blessings of living in a place like Galena, a place far from the constant glow of city lights, is that we can see the stars. Whether it's a clear winter night or one in midsummer, there they are, layer upon layer, seeming to stretch to infinity. Individual stars, the Milky Way, constellations, uncountable. In the same way that grains of sand are uncountable, on a beach that stretches as far as the eye can see, scoop that fine silky sand in your hands, let it trickle through your fingers, each crystal grain shimmering in the sunlight. Can you count them? In last week's story of Noah, we heard of God's first covenant with humanity, a bow in the sky, as a promise that never again would God send a flood to wipe out all but a selected group of creatures. God's covenant with Abraham was the promise of offspring numerous as the stars in the sky, as the grains of sand, and these offspring would inherit the land of Canaan forever. An outrageous promise to an old man with an old barren wife, of course, when the promise was first given. Then they were Abram and Sarah, living in Haran in Mesopotamia, now Turkey. I said when the promise was first given, for where the covenant with Noah played out over 40 days and 40 nights, the covenant with Abraham took about 24 years and was repeated several times. The small segments of this story that we heard in our lectionary selection this morning give us an incomplete picture of these characters, of Abram or Sarai, and even of God. The story that began some 24 years before today's reading is in full a dramatic saga of divine action and human response. One that we might write off to ancient legend or myth, but one that holds wisdom for us in this time and place. The trouble is, without the entire saga, we tend to see Abram as bigger than life, as a paragon of steadfast faith and trust in God. That portrait is not wrong. After all, Abram was called by God to pull up stakes, move his wife, various relatives, servants, and livestock from Haran to the far-off land of Canaan. For this, he was promised that his name would be made great. From him would come a great nation where all families of earth, from generation to generation, would be blessed. He was 75 years old. Imagine that. With only that assurance, he and Sarah obeyed, set off without a map or a GPS, only the tug of God's call, what Barbara Brown Taylor calls the delicate thread stitched lightly through their hearts, that they learned to follow without having to know where or what or why. For that alone, Abram, the patriarch of 3 major religions, deserves to be seen as larger than life. And yet that is not the whole story. It's only in its full span that we see Abram's full humanity, a man who is flawed but faithful, on a journey that does not follow a straight path. It gives him the freedom, since God did not set him onto a straight path, he had the freedom to make wrong turns and mistakes. For Abram, this meant encountering war and famine, trying to save his own skin by passing his wife off as his sister, once to Egypt's Pharaoh, again to the king. Then time stretches on, and there is no offspring. So Abram questions and doubts. But God also does not set the plan in motion and just bow out. God continues to nudge, to restate, and to clarify the promise. First, the offspring will come from Abram's own biological son. But as year after year passed with no offspring in sight, Abram agrees to Sarah's plan. Since she is barren, he will have a son by his servant Hagar. But again, God nudges. The promise is clarified and strengthened. It is an everlasting covenant, after all. The son will not be the one born of Hagar. Sarah will have a child. As a sign, the names are changed. Abram, exalted father, becomes Abraham, father of a multitude. Sarah is now Sarah, princess. It is in this part of the story that Abraham falls on his face laughing at the absurdity of these two, now 99 and 90 years old, parenting a child. Though it's not in the scope of our reading today, we know that the child, Isaac, was born and the saga continued. There were new names and renewed purpose, but the promise was the same. Much has happened in the centuries, the millennia, since the time of Abraham and Sarah, much that makes it seem that the fulfillment of the promise gets farther and farther away. Are things just the same as always? Are they worse? What about in our own lives? A colleague once suggested that in this Lenten season, we should examine what it is that we already have. She used the example of closet and cabinet cleaning and reordering. A lot of us in this time of pandemic, when we're more confined to our homes, are doing exactly this. As we lay all of our closet's contents out on the floor or the bed, what is it that we find? What is our own covenant with God? What is it that we trust? Is it God's promise? Or is it the fickle promise of our world? The promise that if we work really hard, we will succeed, achieve success and admiration, have lovely homes and fast cars. It is all up to us. We are in control of our destiny. For we are recipients of God's promise to Abraham. We are part of the everlasting covenant and the blessing to all families on this earth. Though it often seems incomplete and unfinished, Abraham and Sarah show us that there are always fresh starts with new or renewed purpose. It is a promise that we must live into, moving and growing. Walter Brueggemann tells us that the story in Genesis 17 is an affirmation of faith into the future in the face of experience that denies such a possible future, because it is rooted only in God's good intention, not in our own achievement. We get glimpses and tastes of fulfillment from time to time, and then go off in our circuitous ways. We stumble over the rocks and the roots on the path, both inadvertent mistakes and willful disobedience. But you see, God is trustworthy. God will pursue us when we don't get it quite right. Will nudge us, repurpose us, if we will only listen and trust. Like Abraham and Sarah, we can be exceedingly fruitful, not just in the numbers of descendants, not in perfection, but in a way of life that is filled with the fruit of relationships, beauty, and trust in our God. For we are among the multitude of stars in the sky, the grains of sand on the beach. Thanks be to God. Okay.